The year was 509 BCE, and the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, had been overthrown. In his place, the Roman Republic was born, a system that promised the people power, voice, and law over monarchy. But that promise, from the very start, came with conditions, quiet ones, buried in structure, custom, and class. For though all male citizens could vote, not all votes were equal. The core of Rome's so-called democracy was a centuriate assembly, and that assembly was a machine rig in favor of the elite. Roman citizens were divided into centuries, voting blocks named not for time, but for soldiers, originally rooted in military service. These centuries became tools of political hierarchy. The richest citizens, those who owned vast estates and funded legions, were placed in the first centuries. The poorer citizens, though more numerous, were sorted into the later ones. And it was not just symbolic. Votes were cast in order, beginning with the top. By the time the lower classes had their say, the majority had often already been reached. Each century had a single vote, regardless of how many men it represented. The richest centuries, made up of just a few men, carried the same weight as the most crowded centuries of the poor. So even if 90% of Rome's population voted one way, the election could be decided before they even reached the forum. The first class, the elite, had 80 centuries. The poorest class, the proletariat, had one. It was called a republic, but structurally, it was an oligarchy cloaked in civic ritual. Power rested with those who could afford the armor cavalry, the silver bribes, the time to stand in the heat of the voting field. The poor were expected to cheer and obey, to believe they were part of something greater, even as the system silenced their voice. Many didn't even bother to vote. Some couldn't afford the journey into Rome. Others knew their vote, in the last centuries, was political theater. In theory, this was about stability. Rome feared mob rule as much as tyranny. By giving the elite the first say, they believed the republic could be safeguarded against demagogues. But in practice, it meant power concentrated endlessly upward. Families like the Cornelii, Claudii, and Julii cycled through office after office, generation after generation, while common farmers saw little change in their lives. Over time, the inequality deepened. Debt chained many of the poor. War drained their sons. Their land was bought up by the rich. But in every crisis, the system held firm because the votes that mattered were always cast before the majority could speak. Laws were passed, wars declared, taxes levied, and the centuries nodded in order. By the time the crowd shouted, the decision was already history. The Republic told its citizens they were free. But freedom in Rome came with a coin price, a class boundary, and a silent understanding that elections were not about the people. They were about keeping the illusion alive. And for centuries, it worked. In Rome, seeking office was never a matter of proving competence or winning on ideas. It was a display of wealth, a performance stage for optics and influence. Candidates didn't deliver speeches on policy. They didn't outline plans to fix the grain supply or address urban poverty. They staged gladiatorial games, sponsored chariot races, and distributed free bread to win over the crowds. Elections weren't contests of vision. They were auctions. The higher the office, the higher the cost. Aediles, who managed public works and games, often bankrupt themselves to entertain the masses, not because the position paid well, but because it was a stepping stone to praetorship and eventually the consulship. Holding games meant visibility. It meant gratitude. It meant votes. But only those from powerful, wealthy families could afford such spectacle. The poor couldn't campaign. Even successful merchants or soldiers, if they lacked noble lineage and gold, found the path nearly closed. Candidates walked the streets in pure white togas, toga candida, the origin of our word candidate, symbolizing purity while hiding none of corruption behind the scenes. Their morning ritual was a salutatio, receiving clients in their homes, shaking hands, smiling, and promising favors. But even that was performance. Real deals were made in backrooms with other elites, landowners, generals, financiers. You didn't win an election by convincing Rome. You won by securing enough patrons who could move the crowds and intimidate rivals. Bribery laws existed on paper. The Lex Tullia forbade extravagant campaign spending, and the Lex Sicilia condemned vote buying. But these laws were rarely enforced, and when they were, it was selectively, often used as political weapons against upstart candidates or those who'd fallen out of favor. Everyone knew the rules were being broken. No one cared, as long as the games were grand enough and the grain plentiful. There was also the problem of time. Roman elections didn't occur quietly or quickly. Campaigns could stretch for months. The comitia centuriata, responsible for choosing the highest magistrates, had to convene on the campus martius, and attendance required effort. Rural citizens had to travel to Rome. For most, that meant abandoning farms and risking harvests. As a result, many voters didn't show up at all, leaving the field to the urban population, which was easier to influence and manipulate. The candidates who won weren't always the most capable. They were the ones who understood the system, the ones who knew which families to court, which debts to call in, which tribunes to flatter, which clients to feed, and crucially, which spectacles would impress the crowds. A massive feast in the Forum, a temporary temple dedicated to a new god, a blood-soaked gladiator match in memory of a dead parent. These weren't campaign gimmicks. They were requirements. Even after being elected, the spending didn't stop. Holding office meant owing favors, dozens, hundreds. If you didn't pay back the men who'd funded your campaign, your career ended quickly. So, new magistrates used their positions to reward allies. Tax contracts were handed out, building permits approved, land seizures overlooked. Offices weren't for governance. They were for recovering investment. Some reformers tried to fight this. Gaius Gracchus, for instance, tried to limit senatorial power and open office to new men, but the system resisted. The elite didn't need better governance. They needed stability, predictability, so the flow of wealth and power stayed uninterrupted. And when men like Gracchus pushed too far, they were eliminated. Over time, this cycle created a political caste. Sons followed fathers into office. Names like Scipio, Metellus, and Emilius became fixtures. Even when these men failed, lost wars, mismanaged provinces, caused famine, they returned to power. Their names carried weight, not because of what they did, but because of what their ancestors had paid. By the late Republic, campaign finance had become warfare in disguise. Julius Caesar famously borrowed so much money to fund his run for Pontifex Maximus that he would have faced ruin had he lost. He didn't, and once elected, he paid his debts with spoils from conquest. The line between public service and private fortune vanished. Rome's elections weren't about ideas. They were about investment, and the return always came from the Republic's coffers or from the blood of its provinces. Before Rome adopted secret ballots in the mid-2nd century BCE, voting was performance as much as a civic duty. It took place outdoors, under the eyes of the powerful, in the open air of the campus martius. Citizens didn't cast votes in private booths. They stood in line, walked across wooden gangways called pontes, and publicly declared their choices, loudly enough for patrons, rivals, and clients to hear. Every vote was a statement. Every vote had witnesses. The Roman elite designed it this way. Public voting wasn't just tradition. It was control. If a man owned the land you farmed, paid your debts, or protected you in court, he expected loyalty, especially at the polls. And if you broke that expectation, there were consequences. Your grain allotment might disappear. Your job might vanish. Your sons might no longer find work in the legions or support in legal disputes. Voting wrong wasn't a moral issue. It was a risk. Patronage ran through every layer of Roman life. The wealthy elite didn't just fund games and campaigns. They maintained personal networks, clientela, of poorer citizens who depended on them. A client might receive food, money, or legal aid from his patron, but this wasn't charity. It was transaction. And on election day, the patron watched. Some stood by the voting bridges. Others sent agents. The message was clear. Loyalty was measured in votes. This surveillance extended beyond patrons. Soldiers knew who paid their wages. Tradesmen knew which magistrates issued contracts. Tenants knew who owned their buildings. Even in the vast crowd of the Forum, few felt anonymous. Roman society wasn't structured for privacy. Names, families, associations, they all mattered. And so, elections were navigated carefully, strategically, fearfully. The state made no effort to hide or soften this reality. The physical setup of the vote encouraged visibility. Citizens were herded into lines based on their centuries. Those with higher status went first. Seen by all, they weren't just voting, they were leading. Their decisions set the tone. When a prominent senator declared his choice, the crowd paid attention. Many followed suit out of respect, pressure, or calculation. The practice of ambitus, political canvassing, blurred the line between persuasion and coercion. Candidates approached voters with handshakes, flattery, and promises. But more often, they were backed by armed retainers or thugs. Intimidation was subtle when it could be, brutal when necessary. A knife in the alley, a smashed shop front, a whispered threat to a family member. It didn't have to be frequent to be effective. Rome remembered. The introduction of the secret ballot in 139 BCE, Lex Gabinia, was meant to reduce this pressure. Citizens would now mark their vote on a wax tablet and drop it into an urn. In theory, this protected their choices. But in practice, the influence remained. Patrons still knew how their clients were supposed to vote. Whole voting blocks were still delivered by powerful families. The ballot may have been secret, but the consequences of defiance were not. And even with the reform, the system was hardly foolproof. Illiterate voters required assistance. Ballots could be tampered with. And the presence of derivators, officials who counted the votes, offered new points for manipulation. These men were appointed, not elected. Their loyalties were often political. And so the counting, like the voting, was vulnerable. Even more crucially, the order of voting still prioritized the elite. The wealthiest centuries voted first. Their choices were made early in the day, when the crowd was small and attention sharp. By the time the poorer centuries voted, hours later, sometimes at dusk, the results were often known. Momentum wasn't just psychological. It was structural, and everyone understood this. For the common citizen, elections were a tightrope. Expressing true political will meant risking the wrath of one's benefactor. Staying silent wasn't an option. Participation was expected, but so was obedience. Rome didn't care for independent voters. It rewarded the loyal, the obedient, the predictable. Thus, elections functioned not as expressions of democracy, but as demonstrations of hierarchy. They reminded every man where he stood, who he owed, and what the cost of independence might be. It was civic theater, but behind the stage, real pressure, real fear, and real control shaped every vote cast under the Roman sun. The Roman Senate was the heart of the Republic's political system, but not its soul. It was not elected. It did not represent the masses. It was, from the start, a curated body, a collection of aristocrats chosen more for birth and wealth than for wisdom or public trust. Senators were not chosen by the people. They were selected by censors, officials with the power to fill the ranks with men deemed morally upright, which in Rome meant politically aligned and socially elite. Most senators came from the same families. Names like Fabii, Cornelii, Claudii, and Emilii echoed through centuries of office. These were the nobiles, those whose ancestors had held consulships or other senior magistracies. A seat in the Senate became an inheritance, passed down with villas, slaves, and ancestral masks. Entry wasn't won through merit but through lineage, marriage alliances, or the calculated support of powerful patrons. The Senate's official job was to advise magistrates and control foreign policy, finances, and state religion. In practice, it did more and less. It controlled the treasury. It approved laws. It debated wars. But its most consistent function was preservation. Of its members, their landholdings, their influence, and the illusion that Rome was governed by reasoned debate. Senatorial debates weren't public. Though they took place in the Curia, the building was closed to the average citizen. What happened inside was known only through leaks and second-hand accounts. And even these debates, often dramatized in later histories, were frequently scripted or predetermined. Younger senators listened. Older ones spoke. Decisions were often made in advance, in private homes, over dinners or family meetings. The vote was a formality. Dissent was allowed but rarely effective. A senator could speak against a popular measure, but if he lacked the backing of a strong faction, particularly those aligned with powerful families or generals, his words vanished into the marble. Votes in the Senate were by division or voice, and those with clout could sway dozens with a glance. It was a room where knowing who supported you mattered more than what you said. The Senate often acted less like a legislative body and more like a cartel. It protected its own. Senators who misgoverned provinces were rarely prosecuted, unless their failure had offended the wrong family. Embezzlement, bribery, extortion, these were tolerated, even expected, as long as the profits were shared and the political consequences manageable. The Senate didn't serve the Republic. It managed it like a vast estate, balancing its own interests with those of the wider Roman elite. Occasionally, it pretended to be responsive to public pressure. When popular unrest rose too high, over grain shortages, debt crises, or land disputes, the Senate would sponsor token laws or allow limited reform. But these were always calculated, minimal gestures, designed to appease a crowd without shifting real power. They gave the people the appearance of influence, while keeping the gears of rule oiled and unchanged. Over time, even the few non-aristocratic voices that made it into the Senate were absorbed. The Senate did not reject ambitious outsiders. It assimilated them. A novice homo, a new man like Cicero, could rise, but only if he learned the rules, deferred to old power, and spoke in the language of tradition. Once inside, he either conformed or was destroyed. Worse, the Senate failed in its one true duty, defending the Republic itself. When powerful men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar began bending the rules, raising private armies, or extending command illegally, the Senate didn't resist. It debated. It hesitated. It hoped to benefit from alignment with the strongest man rather than oppose him. Its survival instinct overtook its republican ideals. The Senate often authorized the very powers that undermined it. It gave extended commands to generals. It overlooked unconstitutional actions. It passed emergency decrees, senatus consultum ultimum, that allowed magistrates to bypass law in the name of safety. And each time, it told itself it was temporary, necessary, rational. But each time, the Republic bled a little more. What remained was a shell, a room filled with statues of dead ancestors, and men more concerned with honor, ceremony, and inheritance than with preserving liberty. The Senate outlasted the Republic. Technically, it remained under Augustus. It still met. It still debated. But by then, its voice was faint, its choices approved in advance by the emperor's staff. It had become a theater of tradition, a club playing at politics, long after politics had died. The office of the tribune of the plebs was born from protest, not privilege. In the early years of the Republic, when Rome's patrician elite controlled land, law, and religion, the plebeians, the bulk of the citizen body, walked out of the city. They refused to serve in the army, refused to farm, refused to obey. It was a general strike of the masses. The patricians, panicked by the loss of labor and manpower, compromised. They granted the plebs their own magistrates. 10 tribunes, untouchable by law, empowered to veto legislation and defend the interests of the common man. For a time, it worked. Tribunes challenged unjust laws. They stopped arrests. They stood between the Senate and the people with real legal teeth. If a tribune shouted veto, a law died. No debate, no override. They were the brakes on oligarchy, the one safeguard built into a system that otherwise served a few. But power in Rome was always vulnerable to money, and the tribunate was no exception. The office was meant to be plebeian, but over time, it became attractive to wealthy plebeians. Those who had climbed the social ladder bought land and married into senatorial families. These new nobles had more in common with the aristocracy than with the urban poor. They began to use the tribunate not as a shield for people, but as a launch pad to higher office. Soon, tribunes learned that their veto could be sold. If you blocked a law, you gained leverage. If you lifted your veto, for a price, you gained favor. The office became transactional. Senators courted tribunes to silence opposition. Generals bribed them to pass favorable measures. Governors promised future rewards. And in return, the tribunes traded away the voice of the plebs for senatorial approval or provincial post. There were still moments of resistance. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, used the tribunate to fight for land reform, to redistribute public land to poor, to challenge senatorial dominance. But both were murdered. Their deaths sent a message. A tribune could challenge the elite only once. The office survived, but its soul dimmed. Few dared follow the Gracchi path. Most learned to bend. The mechanics of manipulation were many. A tribune who resisted elite control might find himself politically isolated. His proposals would be ignored. his family threatened, his allies cut off from office. The Senate could delay legislation by procedural tricks. It could declare religious holidays to prevent meetings. It could pass emergency decrees to neutralize vetoes. And if all else failed, violence was always available. Rome did not shy away from bloodshed in the Forum. Armed gangs hired thugs, and loyal mobs became part of the electoral toolkit. A tribune who stood firm might find himself beaten or killed on the very steps of the Curia. Clodius Pulcher, a tribune famed for his radical populism, used mob violence as a political tool. His rivals did the same. When he was finally murdered, his body was burned on a pyre made from the Senate's own benches. By the late Republic, the tribunate had become a tool for larger ambitions. Men like Caesar used tribunes as mouthpieces. They passed laws in his name, vetoed Senate actions that challenged him, and protected his interests with the authority of the people. But they no longer served the plebs. They served the machine of power. The language was still democratic, but the function had been hollowed out. Even attempts to revive the tribunate's integrity failed. Sulla, after his dictatorship, attempted to strip the office of its powers, arguing that it had become too dangerous. He limited its scope, restricted its authority, and ensured that no tribune could seek higher office afterward, making it a dead end. His goal was clear: return Rome to senatorial control. His reforms were later reversed, but the damage was done. The tribunate had been politically neutered, and trust in it never recovered. In the end, the tribune of the plebs, the one office designed to give the common citizen a voice, became just another cog in Rome's corrupt machinery. It retained its form, its rituals, its history, but its function had changed. It no longer resisted the elite. It echoed them, and the people, once defended by the loudest voice in the Republic, were left to cheer for their champions, unaware that those champions had long since changed sides. Every Roman year began with the names of two men, the consuls. They were the twin pillars of state authority, elected annually, holding supreme civil and military power. No law passed without their stamp. No war was waged without their command. Their names dated every decree, every treaty, every public act. And in theory, any citizen could rise to this pinnacle. In theory, the reality was far narrower. From the Republic's earliest centuries, the consulship was the dominion of a small, tight-knit network of aristocratic families. This was not an accident. It was design. Consuls needed wealth to campaign, ancestry to be accepted, and alliances to survive. The office demanded resources few could gather. As a result, even as the Republic expanded across Italy and into the Mediterranean, the pool of consuls remained astonishingly consistent. Dozens of provinces were conquered, hundreds of legions raised. Yet a mere handful of names passed through the highest office, year after year. This pattern bred predictability and exclusion. Young aristocrats were groomed for the cursus honorum, the prescribed ladder of offices leading to the consulship. They served as quaestors, then aediles or tribunes, and praetors, before finally standing for consul. Each step cost money. Each step required endorsements. Even one misstep, a bad speech, an unpopular decision, a public scandal, could destroy a career. But the system forgave those born to the right bloodline. Failures were forgiven if your name was familiar. Success meant little if your name was not. Occasionally, a novice homo, a new man, broke through. Gaius Marius did it. So did Cicero. But these men were rare, and they were never truly welcomed. Marius won the consulship 7 times, but he remained a political outsider, scorned by the old elite. Cicero, despite his brilliance, was constantly reminded of his provincial origins and lack of noble ancestors. When he was exiled, few senators stood up for him. When he returned, his influence was diminished. The establishment tolerated new men only when it had no choice, and moved quickly to contain them afterward. Consular campaigns were brutal, expensive, and deeply personal. Rivals dug up past scandals, whispered rumors, accused opponents of moral or sexual deviance. Trials were used as weapons. Candidates were prosecuted just before elections to derail their bids. Defenders became suspects. Allies were pressured to switch sides. It wasn't just politics. It was war without blood. But sometimes there was blood. In the final century of the Republic, competition for the consulship intensified into open violence. Elections were delayed, then canceled. Candidates were assaulted or murdered. The office lost its civic dignity and became a prize to be seized at any cost. Sulla marched on Rome twice, both times to enforce or secure consular appointments. Julius Caesar did the same in 49 BCE, crossing the Rubicon not for reform, but to prevent trial and secure his share of power. Under normal conditions, consuls were meant to balance each other. Two men elected simultaneously, forced to share command. But this design faltered in practice. When both consuls came from the same faction, they ruled unchecked. When they were rivals, government ground to a halt. Neither could override the other. One could veto the other's decisions. Petty disputes paralyzed the state. Rome's executive branch was always on the verge of dysfunction. The Senate could not always mediate. The people had no recourse. And so, in times of crisis, extraordinary commands were granted. Dictatorships were revived. Consuls were given imperium beyond their term. The separation between civic and military authority faded. A consul might serve for a year in Rome, then 5 more in provinces, leading armies, collecting taxes, building patronage networks that dwarfed anything the Senate could counter. These extended commands birthed warlords. Pompey, granted command against the pirates and then against Mithridates, became more powerful than the state itself. Caesar, sent to Gaul, returned with a veteran army and limitless wealth. Their rivalries consumed the Republic. The consulship, meant to be Rome's highest temporary office, had become a stepping stone to autocracy. And still, the elections continued. Rituals were observed. Tally markers scratched wax tablets. Voters lined up. Candidates donned their white togas. But it was pantomime. Everyone knew who would win. Everyone knew which families mattered. The illusion of equality was maintained, even as the Republic's core corroded. By the end, the consulship still existed, but its meaning had shifted. Under Augustus and his successors, consuls were appointed, not elected. Sometimes they held the office for only part of the year. It had become a ceremonial title, a nod to tradition, no longer a true seat of power. The Republic had died, but the costumes remained. And the consular robes, once symbols of the people's highest trust, became little more than stage props in an empire ruled by one. By the 2nd century BCE, corruption in Rome was no longer a symptom. It was the system itself. Bribes weren't hidden, they were expected. Fraud wasn't scandal, it was routine. The Republic ran not on civic virtue or Republican ideals, but on personal ambition, backroom deals, and open manipulation. Roman elections, laws, and courts were drenched in patronage and deceit so thoroughly that to play clean was to lose before the game even started. Every stage of public life was infected. From the lowest magistracies to the consulship, winning office required immense personal expense. And once in office, a man's primary task wasn't to govern wisely. It was to make that money back. Governors extorted provinces. Judges sold verdicts. Senators accepted payments to sway debates. Corruption wasn't a betrayal of the Republic. It was how you survived in it. Take provincial commands. After their year as consul or praetor, many magistrates were assigned as governors to the outer provinces: Sicily, Hispania, Asia, Africa. There, far from the eyes of Rome, they wielded near total authority. Tax collection was privatized. Wealthy publicani, tax contractors, bid for the right to squeeze local populations. Governors protected them for a cut of the profit. Temples were looted. Local elites were blackmailed. Court decisions were auctioned. Resistance meant execution, or worse, a letter to the Senate that never arrived. Complaints did occasionally reach Rome, but justice was rare. The Senate often ignored these appeals unless the governor had failed politically. And even then, trials were deeply political. A corrupt governor might be tried by a jury filled with his allies. The questions perpetuae, permanent courts for extortion and corruption, were themselves dens of partisanship. When jurors were senators, they acquitted their own. When jurors were equestrians, they used their power to take revenge or settle debts. Guilt or innocence mattered less than whom you defended or paid. Elections were no cleaner. Vote buying was endemic. Laws like the Lex Tullia de Ambitu attempted to restrict campaign spending, forbidding candidates from throwing public banquets or promising gifts. But enforcement was a joke. Money flowed in creative ways. Through middlemen, through indirect gifts, through offers of jobs and contracts after the election. Candidates funded festivals, rebuilt temples, and staged games under the guise of piety. But everyone knew the real goal. It wasn't gratitude. It was votes. The suffragators, professional vote brokers, played a major role. These men organized blocks of voters, especially among the urban poor, and delivered them to the highest bidder. They coordinated how men would vote, helped suppress rival support, and ensured turnout from key districts. They also took payments to disrupt rival campaigns. Throwing ink on a candidate's toga, starting rumors, provoking violence, all were fair tactics. The forum became a marketplace of influence, and the voters became commodities. The manipulation extended even further. Election results were sometimes announced before all the votes were counted. Ballots disappeared. Vote tallies were falsified. If a candidate had enough muscle or enough allies in the derivators, the vote counters, he could win regardless of public support. Everyone understood this. It wasn't hidden. It was accepted. What made it all possible was a collective pretense. Romans, even at their most cynical, continued to speak the language of the Republic. They claimed to serve the residential publica, the public thing. They still celebrated virtus and honor, still pretended that holding office was a service, not a prize. But the gap between rhetoric and reality was vast. No one seriously believed that elections were fair or that laws were passed for the public good. Even moral outrage, when it appeared, was selective. When reformers denounced corruption, they were often using it as a tool to attack enemies. Cato the Younger, famed for his moral rigor, opposed bribery, but turned a blind eye when his allies engaged in it. Cicero condemned vote buying while cutting deals behind closed doors. Integrity was a weapon, not a virtue. The rot was so deep that when true reformers did appear, they rarely lasted. Men like the Gracchi or Sertorius were either killed or driven to the margins. Their attempts to restore dignity to Roman politics were met with scorn from the elite and suspicion from the populace. Even the people had grown accustomed to the system. A candidate who didn't throw games or distribute grain was seen as weak, not principled. In the final decades of the Republic, the fraud grew bolder. Caesar's first consulship in 59 BCE was secured through immense bribery and a secret pact with Crassus and Pompey. In 50 BCE, the Senate debated whether to allow Caesar to run for consul in absentia, another breach of tradition, justified by bribes, threats, and political need. The law bent, then broke, then shattered altogether. No one truly believed in elections anymore. But the forms continued. Rome clung to them because they gave legitimacy to outcomes decided in advance. The lie wasn't that elections happened. The lie was pretending that anyone believed they mattered. The real power came from money, from force, and from fear. The Republic, by then, was a mask stretched tight over an oligarchy cracking from within. By the final generation of the Roman Republic, ballots no longer decided power. Armies did. Political authority had shifted from the forum to the battlefield. Rome still held elections, still followed the forms, but these rituals had been hollowed out. The real contests were waged with legions, not votes. The Republic of Laws had mutated into a Republic of Generals. It began with Marius, a novice homo who broke through the aristocracy's walls. He rose to power not just by political skill, but by commanding loyalty from soldiers. In 107 BCE, he was elected consul to fight Jugurtha in Numidia. But the Senate had already assigned the command to someone else, someone from the old elite. Marius bypassed the system by appealing directly to the people, winning support by promising victory and land to his troops. The rules cracked. Then came Sulla. When his command to fight Mithridates was stripped and handed to Marius, he did the unthinkable. He marched on Rome with his army. It had never happened before. Roman armies were not supposed to cross the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. Sulla did. He took the capital by force, declared enemies of the state, and rewrote the law to protect himself. He left, then returned years later to do it again, this time installing himself as dictator, purging opponents, and filling the Senate with loyalists. From that moment, precedent was dead. Military strength now conferred political authority. Elections, laws, traditions These were still cited, but only as masks for brute force. What counted was who held the legions, who paid the soldiers, who could intimidate or destroy rivals with steel rather than speeches. Pompey, Sulla's protege, learned the lesson well. He secured extraordinary commands by popular acclamation, sweeping powers to deal with pirates, to conquer Mithridates, to reorder the East. His military success made him untouchable in the Senate. He bypassed normal procedures, returned to Rome a hero, and expected to govern as he pleased. When the Senate hesitated to approve his land settlements for his veterans, he turned to Caesar and Crassus and formed the first triumvirate, a private agreement to dominate the state. Caesar pushed the system even further. His consulship in 59 BCE was secured through bribery and violence, but it was what followed that truly broke the Republic. Sent to Gaul, he stayed there nearly a decade, conquering lands, building an army loyal to him, not Rome. When the Senate, fearing his return, demanded he disband his troops and return for trial, he refused. Instead, in 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon. It was not just a military maneuver. It was a declaration. The state was now subordinate to the sword. Caesar's civil war against Pompey destroyed the last illusions of the Republic. He pursued his enemies across Italy, Greece, and Egypt. He took over the treasury, issued decrees without Senate approval, filled offices with his allies. He was appointed dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. The tribunes, the Senate, the consuls, all remained in name, but they no longer mattered. Caesar made the decisions. His soldiers enforced them. Rome's constitutional machinery creaked forward, but without substance. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic had a moment to right itself, but it had lost the habit of lawful governance. The killers claimed to have restored liberty, but they had no army. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, had won. So did Mark Antony. So did Lepidus. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate and turned the city into a battlefield once more. They declared enemies by name, Cicero among them, and unleashed prescriptions, legalized murder lists in exchange for political support and confiscated wealth. The wars that followed, Philippi, Perugia, Actium, weren't about laws or elections. They were about who would control the machinery of the state. The people no longer mattered. The assembly still voted, but only to ratify what had already been won by force. Land was promised to veterans to secure their loyalty. Citizens were relocated or murdered. The Republic's framework remained, but it now functioned as the bureaucratic arm of personal regimes. Even as Octavian, later Augustus, dismantled the opposition, he kept the forms intact. He held elections, accepted votes, passed laws. But behind the scenes, every position was decided by him. Every general served at his pleasure. Every province answered to his legates. The Senate still met, but only to approve. The people still cheered, but only when permitted. Victory was no longer declared at the ballot box. It was delivered by legions marching through the ashes of Republican liberty. The civil wars had proven one thing. In Rome, power did not belong to those with the best policies or the support of the people. It belonged to those who could command men to kill. And once that principle had taken root, no amount of tradition could restore what was lost. The Republic, technically, had not ended, but it had become irrelevant. Its elections continued, but only after the outcome was written in blood. When Octavian emerged as the sole victor after years of civil war, he faced a dilemma. The Roman people had grown weary of chaos. They craved peace, but they also remembered tyranny. They still idolized the Republic, or at least the idea of it. So Octavian, soon to be Augustus, crafted a new regime not by destroying the old system outright, but by absorbing it. He didn't abolish the Republic. He replaced its function while preserving its form. He called himself princeps, not king. The word meant first citizen, not ruler. He claimed to have restored the Republic, to have relinquished extraordinary powers back to the Senate and the people in 27 BCE. But what he actually did was consolidate control in a way no Roman before him had achieved. He controlled the army. He controlled the treasury. He controlled the courts. And through carefully arranged elections, he controlled who entered public office. Augustus never needed to rig a vote outright, because he ensured only his approved candidates were nominated. He dominated the comitia, the voting assemblies, Through indirect influence, elections still took place, but the results were known in advance. The names on the ballots had been whispered months before by imperial agents. Augustus chose his successors, governors, magistrates, all behind the scenes. The people still marked their votes, still gathered in the forum, but their choices were limited to those handpicked by the emperor. He retained the Senate, expanding it, rewarding loyalists, purging dissenters through soft exile or subtle threat. He encouraged public debate, but kept the real levers of power behind the curtain. The Senate's decrees followed imperial suggestions. Tribunes, once protectors of the people, were now imperial puppets. Augustus himself was granted tribunician potestas, tribunician power, permanently. Even though he wasn't tribune, he didn't need the title. He had the authority. He also held imperium maius, a greater command over all provincial armies, ensuring no rival general could rise against him without crossing legal bounds. His command superseded all others, yet was couched in legal terms, ratified by Senate votes, endorsed by public acclamation. Augustus rewrote the Constitution, not by dismantling it, but by inhabiting it so completely that no room remained for anyone else. Public festivals, temples, and monuments reinforced this facade. Coins bore his image, but titles remained republican. Consul, Imperator, Pontifex Maximus. His image was everywhere, yet he refused the crown. He honored elections, but every candidate owed him allegiance. Rome had not replaced its system. It had hollowed out and filled it with the shape of one man. Even succession was disguised. When Augustus sought to groom an heir, he didn't declare a prince. He maneuvered family members, Marcellus, Agrippa, Tiberius, into high offices, giving them military commands and titles that positioned them as natural successors. Each step was framed as public service. Each appointment approved by the Senate, ratified by the people, praised in the streets. But every Roman knew whose hand had guided the process. This careful management extended to the myth of stability. Augustus promoted the idea that the Republic had been restored after decades of bloodshed. Statues and literature celebrated his restraint. He refused lifelong dictatorship, unlike Caesar. He accepted honors reluctantly. The Senate voted him Pater Patri, father of the country, but this was a carefully staged act. His power was permanent, legal, and absolute. Opposition was rare, and when it surfaced, it disappeared quietly. There were no more dramatic assassinations in the Senate, no more tribunician revolts. Augustus eliminated threats before they could grow through exile, surveillance, and political sidelining. He didn't need to destroy rivals in public. He made sure they never rose to begin with. And still, the Republic's forms persisted. Consuls were elected each year. Sometimes Augustus himself served, sometimes allies. Tribunes still vetoed laws, except they never vetoed the emperor. Assemblies still gathered, still passed legislation, always proposed by imperial agents. The machinery moved, but the gears turned only with Augustus's blessing. Even historians of the era, such as Livy, framed this as a rebirth, not an end. The Republic had been saved, they said, refined, rescued from the brink. But behind these words was silence, an awareness that real power no longer came from ballots or speeches, but from access to the emperor's favor. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome mourned a statesman, but what they buried was the final breath of republican independence. His successor, Tiberius, didn't stage a coup. He didn't need to. The system Augustus built transferred seamlessly because it had been designed to look like a republic while functioning as a monarchy. The transition was bloodless, but it was absolute. From that point forward, emperors reigned behind masks of old offices. Votes were still cast, offices still filled, senators still debated. But the outcome of every election, every decision, every law had already been written in the private halls of imperial power. Augustus had not abolished democracy. He had embalmed it, preserved its outer form while draining it of life. And Rome, weary of war, embraced the peace he offered, even if it came at the cost of their voice. The death of Augustus marked the end of any plausible belief that the Roman Republic still functioned as a democracy. But Rome didn't stop holding elections. It didn't dismantle the Senate. It didn't abandon the forms of its old constitution. Instead, it preserved every ritual, every title, every law, while draining them of meaning. The Republic wasn't overthrown. It was embalmed in ceremony and tradition, left to rot beneath a polished surface of continuity. In the centuries that followed, emperors came and went, some strong, some weak, some competent, some mad, but none ruled without cloaking themselves in the robes of republican legitimacy. They held consulships, or granted them to loyalists. They addressed the Senate as if it mattered, even when decisions had already been made in the palace. They allowed votes to take place, rigged, empty, and predetermined, as if the people still had a say. Even the imperial court mimicked republican structures. The emperor's advisors took titles like Concilium Principis, echoing the Senate's advisory role. The Praetorian Guard, a private army for the emperor, dressed in the uniform of civic guardianship. Imperial proclamations were issued as senatus consulta, Senate decrees, even when senators had merely rubber-stamped a foregone conclusion. The elections that remained were increasingly irrelevant. Candidates were chosen by imperial favor, often from a shrinking pool of aristocratic families with the right lineage and connections. By the time of the Flavians and Antonines, the emperor appointed consuls personally, sometimes rotating them every few months to spread the honor around. The office retained prestige, but none of its former power. It was an ornament, an award, not a position of authority. Assemblies of the people, the comitia centuriata, comitia tributa, and concilium plebis, faded into ceremonial irrelevance. They no longer initiated laws, chose magistrates, or debated policy. Their meetings grew infrequent. Attendance dropped. Their votes were formalities, arranged in advance and supervised by imperial agents. The crowds once vibrant in the Forum now watched games in the Circus Maximus, while decisions about their lives were made far from public view. And yet the rituals persisted. The Senate still opened its sessions with sacrifices and invocations to the gods. Magistrates still wore the toga praetexta and sat on the sella curulis. Laws were still posted on bronze tablets. The symbols remained intact because they served a purpose. They gave illusion of continuity, the comfort of tradition, the dignity of Rome's imagined past. As long as the forms were respected, few cared that their substance was gone. This endurance of form without function was no accident. The emperors understood that power lasted longer when it disguised itself. Outright tyranny provoked resistance, but a regime that looked familiar, one that invoked the language of liberty, even as it eliminated it, could survive for generations. The people, wearied by centuries of civil war, were less interested in political participation than in stability, food, and security. The Republic was dead, but its theater kept the peace. Even under emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, philosopher kings who ruled wisely, the old institutions had no real influence. The Senate debated only what the emperor allowed. Laws were issued as constitutions principis, imperial edicts that bypassed all traditional legislative bodies. Justice came not from elected magistrates, but from imperial officials. Governors were appointed from above, not chosen by assemblies. By the 3rd century CE, the illusion frayed further. The empire grew unstable. Civil wars erupted. Barracks emperors seized power with army support, caring nothing for legality. But still, even in chaos, they adopted republican titles. Even when emperors ruled from frontier garrisons or eastern capitals, they claimed to restore the Senate, to uphold the traditions of the mos maiorum. Their lies echoed through marble halls that once housed debate, now filled with silence. Constantine would later embrace Christianity, not to dismantle Rome's legacy, but to adapt it. He built a new capital, Constantinople, modeled on Rome's grandeur, with a Senate of its own, with temples and forums and arches, but no republic beneath. And centuries later, when the Western Empire collapsed in 476 CE, the Senate still existed in name. It still convened. It still claimed to represent the Roman people. But it had no army, no budget, no laws to pass. It had become a ghost, a husk. In the end, the Republic died not with a bang, but with a whisper. There was no grand abolition, no moment when democracy was declared over. It died incrementally, through exceptions made in crisis, through powers granted temporarily, through reforms that centralized authority in the name of order. And with each step, Rome told itself it was still free, still a republic, still the model of civilized governance. What killed the republic wasn't dictatorship. It was the erosion of belief. People stopped believing their vote mattered. Senators stopped believing their voice counted. Tribune, consul, censor, all the offices continued to exist, but the meaning behind them had vanished. Elections became rituals. Debate became ceremony. Governance became theater. The tragedy wasn't that Rome lost its republic. The tragedy was that it buried it beneath tradition and called the grave democracy.